Good evening. Sorry I missed last week. Got stuck in the rain. So I want to try and pick up from our last talk. Very briefly, we said that what we're doing now is we're looking for logical, rational evidence of why it makes sense to believe in God. We started with this idea of design. There's a designer. We said there's some basic logical flaws in the argument, really pointed out by the philosophers, and I believe they're good caches. So we moved on beyond that, and we said, okay, forget about designer. We look bichlal at the whole bria, and we realized, this is already getting on to the second answer, we realized bichlal that the whole world, on every level, follows a system of cause and effect. Right? Everything comes from something else. A standard comes from a piece of wood, which comes from a tree, which comes from a seed, which comes from a tree. And when you follow that reasoning, you realize that if everything comes from something, which comes from something, if that's the nature of finite things have causes, then you're stuck with the question, how'd the whole thing get started? What created the first finite thing? So there are some difficulties with the idea, but before we get to them, I want to deal with one other question that often comes up over here. Right? In the name of being intellectually honest, we sort of skipped a step. It's true that if we live in a finite universe, then you have to ask the question, what created finite altogether? If we're saying it can't come from something finite, the answer must be infinite. That's all true, assuming that the universe had a beginning. If the universe had a beginning, then it's fair to ask the question, who began it? What began it? But we never considered the possibility, which is logically a possibility, that there was no beginning. Olam Kadmon, the world's always been here one way or another, going all the way back. Really, the whole Aristotelian idea of an infinite universe, an eternal universe, seems to avoid the idea of needing a God altogether. In other words, coming from a Western world and coming from a Torah world, both of them, were so immersed in the idea that there was a Bereshis, or there was a Big Bang, or there was a beginning, that it's a davar pashut to say if there's a beginning, there's a beginner. But if you really go back, until 50 years ago, 80 years ago, the world didn't hold by the idea of a Big Bang. The world only discovered the idea of a Big Bang, less than 100 years ago. Before that, most scientists will tell you, and most philosophers would have told you, the world has always been here in one form or another. Had no beginning. There's the famous Maisa, the Greek scholar Aristophanes. The students come to Aristophanes one day and they ask him the question, what's holding the world up? Did I mention this last class? No? What's holding the world up, right? This whole world, everywhere you look, is just air all around us. What's keeping the whole thing up? What's holding the whole world up in the air? So Aristophanes answered and said, really the world is being held up by the great god Atlas. Atlas is holding up the world. You've probably seen statues, right? This guy with the whole planet on his shoulders. Atlas is holding up the whole world. He's holding up everything. So the students ask Aristophanes, if Atlas is holding up everything, if he's holding up the whole thing, everything, then what's holding him up? What's he standing on? So Aristophanes said, Atlas is standing on the back of a giant turtle. There's a giant turtle. Atlas is standing on the turtle, and Atlas is holding the whole world up. So the students ask the next obvious question, okay, if the turtle is holding everything up, holding up Atlas, holding up the world, what's holding the turtle up? What's it standing on? Aristophanes said, the turtle is standing on the back of another turtle. What's holding that turtle up? Standing on the back of another turtle. What's holding that turtle up? Aristophanes puts up his hand and he says, it's turtles all the way down. There's no first turtle. There's no beginning. The world didn't get here. It's always been here. There's no first human being. There's no Adam. There's no first human being. There have always been human beings. Now that sounds really bizarre to us. You got to have a first, have a second, and a third, and a fourth. It's got to start somewhere. But if you think about it, what's the logic to say that there has to be a beginning? Torah says it. Modern science says it. Big Bang cosmology says it. But how do you prove it? How do you prove the world is not infinitely old? Right? You can sort of slice it up. Torah says the world is 57, 70 years old. Science says the world is 15 billion years old. But most of the world, for most of humanity's existence, philosophers and scientists have believed the world has no age. It's infinitely old. It's just been going on and on forever. How do we know that's not true? So the simple answer is, we've proven that there's a Big Bang. Every scientist in the world today believes there was a Big Bang. When a scientist says the world is 15 billion years old, right, that's a whole topic we have to deal with. Age of the universe, we say thousands, they say billions. That's a topic we'll get to. But at least we're talking about an amount of time. When a scientist says the world is 15 billion years old, what he's saying is it started 15 billion years ago. Before that, there was no such thing as a world. There was no time, there was no space, there was no energy, there was nothing. And a world began. Okay, if you believe in a Big Bang, you can say someone had to make it go bang. You're saying it all started from a particle. You could say, okay, you have to explain where the particle came from. But logically, how did the Rambam deal with this? The Rambam in the Morah has a whole discussion of this question of why don't we believe in an eternal universe? The Chovos Levavos, Shar HaYichud, goes through a whole explanation of why we don't believe in an eternal universe. They didn't believe in a Big Bang back then. They didn't know anything about the world having a beginning according to science or logic. According to science. So what's the logic? What's the logic to say the world had a beginning? So if we can answer that, what we're going to see is it begins to give us an understanding not only of the proof that there's an infinite that made finite, but what it really is going to give us is a bit of a hasaga of what we mean by infinite altogether. Okay? When the Greeks come along and say the world had no beginning, it's been here in one form or another forever. What's the basic logical problem? The basic logical problem is that the Greeks are taking this thing that we're aware of called time, seconds, minutes, hours, years, this thing that we know called time, this finite quantity that you can measure, and they're saying that this finite thing called time adds up to being an infinite amount of it. There's an infinite amount of this finite thing called time. I'm not saying specifically because we have watches and we measure hours. I'm saying the idea of time is a measurable thing. You can measure a unit of time. So what the Greeks are saying is those units of time, when you add them all up, become an infinite amount. So if you examine that idea, you realize logically, the idea of an infinite amount of anything doesn't make any sense. It's an oxymoron to talk about an infinite and talk about an amount. Amount means it's countable. Countable means it's finite. It might be more than I can count. It might be a huge number, but it's countable if it's a finite thing. Remember, I was doing a couple of years ago math homework with my daughter in grade 4. She had to do multiplication tables. So she has to memorize all the numbers up to 9 times 9. So I'm testing her. What's 3 times 7? What's 2 times 4? What's 8 times 7? Going through, she's doing very well. I say, okay, final question. What's 9 times 9? Gives me the answer, 81. I say, okay, let me ask you another question. What's 10 times 10? Wasn't part of the question, but what's 10 times 10? She said, I don't know. I said, well, let's draw it out, right? 10 squares, 10 rows. It's 100. So she thinks for a second. She says, well, then what's 20 times 20? I said, 400. And I can see her mind starts going. She says, Abba, how high does it go? Like, what's the last number? I said, there's no such thing as a biggest number. No, Abba, what do you mean? Like, what's the biggest number? There's no such thing as a biggest number. Whatever number I tell you, you can just ask me, what happens when you add 1? What happens when you multiply it by 10? There's no such thing as a biggest number. We're used to the idea of thinking of infinite as a lot of numbers. But that can't logically be true in a finite physical world. What's the essential problem of talking about infinite time in a world where time is this finite quantity? What's the difficulty? Because the Greeks are essentially saying the world is infinitely old, yet at the same time, what do we notice about this world? It's getting older all the time. I'm getting older, the sun is getting older, things are decaying, more things are happening that haven't happened yet, the world is going through a process of decay. The Greeks would say, the world is infinitely old, and yet it's getting older. Does that make sense? It's logically a total contradiction. It's like saying I have something in my backyard that's infinitely big, but it's getting bigger all the time. What do you mean? If it's getting bigger, it means it has a size. If it's getting bigger, it means it's bigger than it was yesterday, which means there's a size to it. If there's a size, it's not infinite. It's big. You might say the world is so old, it goes so far back, we can't calculate how old it is. We can't calculate the number of billions or trillions of years. It's too big of a number for us. You can talk about something being uncountable, but infinite is a self-contradiction. Just like something bigger, something getting bigger is not infinitely big, it's just finitely big. If something is getting bigger, it's not an infinite size. If something is getting older, it's not an infinite age. It's the exact same idea. There's a basic logical difficulty in talking about infinite and finite in the same breath. When we say infinite created finite, what are we saying? We're saying there's this thing, for lack of a better word, called infinite, which is not a bunch of anything. It's not made up of molecules or energy or midos or ruchnias or energy. It's not made up of stuff. Infinite is a totally different quality of existence than finite. When people say things like, what if you create something that lasts forever? I'm going to make a machine that's so strong, nothing can ever destroy it. This machine will last forever. Is that called an infinitely old machine? No. 100 years from now, it'll be a 100-year-old machine. In a trillion years, it'll be a trillion-year-old machine. At no point will it become infinitely old. It's going to keep getting older. You can say it will keep expanding potentially. Its age will keep going on and on and on. But at any actual given point in time, it is an age. You hear the idea? If we look at ourselves and say we live in a world where there's new generations being born all the time, okay, that means there's got to be an amount of generations that have been here. There can't be an infinite number. An infinite number of generations have been around, and yet there's more. The next generation is yet to be born to add on to the infinite. So the pile got bigger, even though it's infinitely big. There's a basic contradiction between saying that something is finite, like time or space or molecules, and saying that when you add it up, somehow it becomes this other thing altogether called infinite. Yeah. Very good. Odd numbers, right, very good. Very good. So the famous example of Leibniz was exactly that. The famous mathematical example is, if you look at the set, he was slightly different. He said, imagine the set of all numbers. All numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, ... How many numbers are in that set? Infinite number. No end to it, right? What if I compare the set of all real numbers to the set of all even numbers? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, right? The set of all even numbers compared to the set of all numbers. The set of all even numbers, how many numbers are in that set? Infinite number. But it's only half as many as the ones in the first set. The first set is twice as big as the second set, yet they're both infinitely big. What does that mean? What it means is that this concept that we call infinite is a concept you can play around with. You can double it, you can half it, as long as you're dealing with a theoretical thing called number sets. When you're dealing with real things, like time and space and molecules, real things are finite. Numbers don't exist as realities. Numbers are concepts that we've created. The idea of a 4 or a 6 or a number set or an even number set, there's no such thing in the real world as a set of even numbers. It's a concept that we created. When we try and apply ideas of infinite in the theoretical sense to a finite physical world of actual stuff, the whole thing breaks down. The famous Greek example proves it. The Greek example of Zeno. Zeno's example, I hate to quote more Greek than I'm quoting Rabbanim, but I'll try and do better in the second half of this year. Zeno's example was like this. Zeno said, it's a perfect example of this idea. Zeno said, imagine I want to go across a room. I'm standing over here, I want to get to the second side of the room, okay? And imagine there's 10 meters between me and the other end of the room. So let's look at me traversing these 10 meters as a mathematical problem, okay? Mathematically, in order for me to go to the other side of the room, I first have to cross half the room. I have to cross 5 meters, right, in order to get there. In order to traverse those 5 meters, I got to cross half of that. In order to cross those 2.5 meters, I have to cross half of that, and half of that, and half of that, and half of that. As a mathematical problem, how many times can I keep dividing the space between me and that wall? An infinite number. Which means if I looked at this problem as a mathematical problem, I could never possibly cross the room and get to the other wall. Because there's always an infinite number of divisions between me and there. How could I possibly go through that infinite number of divisions? It'll take me forever. But guess what? You can walk and touch the wall. It's not a big deal. Because when you try and apply an infinite, a theoretical idea of infinite to a real world of real finite, all the analogies break down. Because the mistake the Greeks made was to say that infinite is part of the finite reality. That's exactly why that analogy doesn't work. Of course you can cross the room. Mathematically it's impossible, but we do it all the time. Dealing with a theoretical idea of infinite has nothing to do with real world issues, real world things like molecules and seconds. Right? I'll give you just one more mushel of this. You'll see the idea. Imagine if I told you, if you walk outside here, out in front of the base medrash, you see a huge pile of marbles. Little glass, see-through, transparent marbles. And you look, and just like everywhere you look, there's just marbles and marbles and marbles. You take a telescope, you look through, they seem to go on forever in every direction. Okay? You have no way of possibly counting all them. They just go in every direction, out to the universe, out to past the planets. They're everywhere. So I ask you the question, is this pile of marbles, how many marbles are there? Is there an infinite number, or is there a finite number? So you think theoretically, maybe there's an infinite number. Maybe there's no end. Maybe there's mamash an infinite amount of marbles here. So I would say I can prove you wrong. There's no such thing as an infinite number of anything. You know how I prove it? Very simple. What would happen if I take one marble from the pile out and I smash it up? What's left in the pile, infinite or finite? If you say infinite, so what does that mean? It's infinite, but it's a little smaller than it was before because we took out one marble? You can't have smaller and bigger infinites if you're talking about real things. You want to say I take a marble out, what's left is finite? So what does that mean? One less than infinite is finite? If I put the marble together again and I put it back in the pile, it went from finite to infinite? It crossed the edge? There's no edge! Taking the marble out, putting the marble back in proves to you that there's no such thing as an infinite number of marbles. It's a finite pile. I might not have any way of counting it. It might be so big I'll never get to figure out how big it is. But you know that if you're dealing with things, no matter how much you add them up, you add more and more and more and more, finite plus finite plus finite can always only equal finite. There's no edge where you tip over and go to the thing called infinite. Infinite is a totally different quality. So the Rambam and really the Chovos HaLevavos, when they tackle this question, that's basically what they're saying. That when the Greeks talk about the idea of the world being infinitely old, it's been around for an infinite number of seconds, and yet that pile of infinite seconds is getting bigger and bigger as the days go on. There's been an infinite number of generations, and yet there's more generations still coming, is a logical total contradiction. You have to make up your mind. It's either finite or infinite. It can't be finite and have an infinite quality to it. So again, forever means theoretically it'll keep getting older and older. Right? If we didn't have a haftacha from Hashem that the world has an end, 6,000 years or whatever, and theoretically, let's say science has said there's nothing that's going to cause the universe to collapse, it's just going to keep going and going and going. Okay, so what are they saying? Right now it's 15 billion years old, then it'll be 100 billion years old, then it'll be a quadrillion years old, but there's no such thing as reaching the day called forever. It just gets older and older and older. The number gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But at any actual given time, it is an age. It never comes. The day doesn't come where you go, ding, the world has now been around forever. There's no such thing. As long as time goes on, the world goes on. The world gets older. But it's always an age. What do you mean?
They're saying it's been around forever.
Right.
We give it a number of years.
Right.
Forget the number of years. They say it's been around forever, which means there is no number of years that it's been around.
Yes, the question is not the number. The question is if it has been around and same thing. Even if you say there's no such thing as seconds or minutes, the world is getting older. right? The world is older today than it was yesterday. I'm older today than I was yesterday.
Numbers go to infinity, there's a high number and a low number.
Theoretically, yeah, but in the real world, no. Again, to say it's infinitely old, forget about hours, minutes, or years. It's not a question of how you measure it. It's saying that it's infinitely old and yet it's getting older is the same as saying something is infinitely big and getting bigger. It's not a question of how many meters big. If I'm saying it's getting bigger, it's the same as saying it has a size. If I'm saying something is getting older, it's the same as saying it has an age.
Instead of using the word older, just use the word decrease to exist.
Okay, but then you're avoiding the question. It is getting older. The sun is decaying compared to how it was yesterday. I'm aging compared to how I was yesterday. The world is clearly getting older. Things are happening now that didn't happen yesterday. Again, in theory it can, in mathematics it can, but what does that mean in a real world problem? If something has a finite quality to it, finite means it's measurable. You can, again, what you're thinking of are examples of rays or parallel lines or something that has a starting point on an axis and it approaches infinity. Those are all ideas that work in the world of theory. None of them apply to actual real world things of real objects. Let me just do this. I want to show you the other side of the equation, then we'll see where we're holding with this. We look at the Greeks and we say, your idea of the world having no beginning is logically impossible. But we also realize the Greeks weren't idiots. Aristotle was a smart guy. He had ways of, he understood where we were coming from. What's the difficulty the Greeks had with our idea? Our idea seems so much more logically simple. We believe there's a thing called finite, so something else made it called infinite. Why don't we just buy that idea because it's so much more logically clean? The answer is because the Greeks would look at us and say, we've got a kasha on you as much as you have a kasha on us. You want to time that there's this thing called infinite that created another thing called finite? That's also schwer. What's the difficulty of saying that infinite created something called finite? Why is that difficult? There's no room for both of them. Very good. How could I be here measuring them? There's a place where there's no marbles. Exactly. If you talk about infinite, you can't talk about infinite creating something else called finite. That's the problem with our picture. We want to say there's finite, logically, therefore there must be a thing called infinite. What's the difficulty with that? Once you believe in a thing called infinite, so where's there room for something else, something other than infinite called finite? So what are we going to say? We're not really here? We're all just pieces of God? We're not pieces of God. God doesn't have pieces. Infinite isn't divided into chunks. Infinite isn't divisible. It's infinite. It's a whole different quality of existence. So the Greeks look at us and say, your difficulty with your picture is just as schwer, maybe more schwer than our picture is. You have a tie on us that we say the world is infinitely old and getting older. We're adding on to infinite time. You're adding on to infinite existence. That's our problem. So how do we deal with that?
Why isn't that an acceptable answer to say that the physical world is just a manifestation of the infinite being?
It sounds nice, but what does it really... Again, I'm talking about real things.
There's only infinite or a physical manifestation of infinite.
So this watch is a physical manifestation of infinite?
It has an element of that inaudible. It only is this infinite.
Infinite doesn't have elements. It's not made up of anything. To say the watch is God is probably kfira. To say the watch isn't God, well, there's God out there, but not over here. That's also kfira, right? Well, there's an edge. God's only out there, but the finite and the physical, that's not God. To say that it is God is difficult. To say that it's not God is difficult. So the Greeks look at us and say, you guys are just as stuck as we are. So what's the answer? We're going to get to in a second. But I'll tell you this. Before we get to the answer, there's one other problem here I want to look at just quickly to sort of dispose of. Most people, when they encounter this idea, get stuck on a different problem before we get to this problem. Most people get stuck on the following. We want to say that it's logical that if there's a finite, there must be something else called infinite. What's the difficulty that most people have? Most people's difficulty is, what is this thing called infinite? Can you define it? Can you describe it? What are you going to say about infinite? It's indescribable. It's undefinable. It has no form. It has no shape. It has no size. It's beyond anything you could possibly imagine. So if it's that unimaginable, how in the world am I supposed to believe in it? You're telling me that it's logical to believe in something that's totally unimaginable. That doesn't make sense. Like, what am I supposed to think about? You're telling me there's a real thing called infinite? Well, what is it? I can't explain it. I can't define it. I can't imagine it. It has no form, no shape, no size. It's beyond time. It's beyond space. It's beyond anything you could possibly ever imagine. There's no mushal you could possibly come up with that describes what it is, even as a mushal. So then how am I supposed to believe in it? People's difficulty is, as much as the idea of infinite might be logical, if it's unimaginable, we get stuck. When my kids ask me, what does Hashem look like? So I answer and I say, Hashem doesn't look like anything. What do they think I mean? They think what I mean is, I don't really know what Hashem looks like. I haven't seen him yet. That's not what I mean. What I mean is Hashem doesn't look like anything. But what is that supposed to mean? I don't know. I just can't describe it. People get stuck there. So I'll give you an interesting Maisa that I had that gets us around this problem at least, and it'll get us back to that problem. Maisa I had was like this. I had a number of years ago, I was giving a shir at Aish on this Nakuda. And I had a group of guys in a classroom very bothered. You're telling me that it's logical to believe in God, even though there's no way that you can describe anything about what God actually is. Like, that sounds like a total contradiction. So mamash, a tremendous act of hashgacha happens. I'm sitting in class. All of a sudden, a guy comes walking in the room with a white cane. A blind man comes walking in the room. Okay? I don't know where he is. I don't know where he's from. Sits down in the back of the class. For 5 minutes, this blind man is listening to this whole vikuach going on in class. And he puts up his hand, and he says, I can describe exactly what your problem is. I said, go ahead. He says, I've been blind my entire life. I don't know what things look like. He says, I know what square means because I can understand things having an edge. I know what round means because I can feel things that are round. He says, but I have no idea what people mean when they talk about color. What do you mean the sky is blue? What do you mean the sweater is yellow? What's blue? What does blue mean? So if you were to ask this blind man, he said it in his own words, he says, to me, the idea that there's a blue is totally logical. You ask anybody in the world what color the sky is, they'll all say blue. Logically, it must be that there's a thing called blue. What is it? I have no idea. He sits down with you and you ask him, he asks you the question, can you spend a few minutes, describe to me what blue is? Give me a sense. What's blue? What are you going to tell him? For a blind man who doesn't see, the idea of color, the whole concept of color, is totally unimaginable. So what are we going to say? I can't imagine it, therefore it doesn't exist? It's a silly conclusion. I can't imagine it because I'm so stuck in my blindness, I don't know what color is. So the blind man says to me, says to the classroom, he says, we're also locked into this thing called finite. We can't imagine what infinite is. I can only imagine things because they have a shape or a size or a definition. I'm part of a finite world. I'm locked into it. Does it mean infinite doesn't exist? No. There's a strong logic to say infinite exists. The problem isn't that I can't... The problem is not the logical conclusion. The problem is that I just can't imagine it because I'm stuck in the world of finite. Not a kasha. So what is the real kasha? The kasha is, where's the room for finite if you have an infinite, right? And now we realize we're dealing with a very conceptual issue. It's not... I don't want to imagine infinite taking up all the space and then where's the finite going to fit in? Infinite doesn't take up any space. There's no such thing as space. It's a very conceptual, logical difficulty. If infinite is unlimited, then you can't talk about infinite creating finite. Because then you're saying infinite created something other than it that somehow exists separate from infinite. But there's no such thing as separate from infinite. Infinite doesn't have an edge. That's the kasha. So I'll give you a teretz that I use in class. It's really an idea I got from Nefesh HaChaim, but I found that the Shiurei Das really spells it out very nicely. Nefesh HaChaim sort of hints at it in Shar Gimel. But the mashal I would use is this. If you want to talk about the idea of infinite creating finite, like how does that happen? What does it mean that God made something else exist? So think of it like this. When Torah says Bereshis bara Elokim. The idea of bara, we understand, is yesh me'ayin. It's yesh me'ayin. We've never in our lives experienced a yesh me'ayin. Science tells us that in the world we live in, there is energy here. Everything that we see, somebody builds a stender, it's not something out of nothing. It's energy. We just took it from the tree and made it into a stender. You burn it up, so the energy goes from being wood into being the energy of fire and heat. Everything in this world is just different forms of energy, and all we do is we take things, we shape them, and we build them, and we destroy them. We're just shifting around the energy. The idea of yesh me'ayin, something out of nothing, we have no idea what that really looks like. We can picture it maybe, just like poof, something exists. But what it really means, we've never experienced it. So what does Torah mean when it says Bereshis bara Elokim? It means Hashem can create even though there's nothing there. There's no raw materials to work with. It's something literally out of nothing. What does that mean? How does that answer our question? If you think about it, when we want to make something, when we want to create something, there's two stages. Stage number one, I have to have the ratzon of what I want a stender, or I want a cup of coffee, or I want a chocolate cake. Stage two, get the ingredients, put them together, and make your cake. But the first stage of every creation is the ratzon to have it. I've got this image in my mind, I want cake. Now let me get the ingredients and make the cake. For Hashem, there's no second stage of getting the stuff and putting it into the cake. He doesn't need it because there's no raw materials to work with. How does Hashem create? Pure ratzon. For Hashem to create something, all he has to do is want it to exist. Hashem's ratzon that something should exist. Derech Hashem says this in the first parak. It says the whole bria is just ratzon Hashem. That Hashem creating just means Hashem has a ratzon that something should exist. Vayomer Elokim yehi or, vayehi or. Meaning what? Hashem wanted light to exist, and therefore light exists. His wanting it gave light a mitzias. But what is that mitzias called light? Or a rock? All that thing is Ratzon Hashem. That's all it is Ratzon Hashem. Is it something separate from Hashem? No, it's His Ratzon. It's not its own thing. It's not independent. It's His Ratzon. So the mashal I use to describe this idea, to make it a little more tangible, is think about it like this. If I ask you right now, I ask everybody in the room to create an apple tree. Make an apple tree. Can you do it? You can go get some seeds and earth and water and wait a few years. Or, where's the realm where you can create an apple tree instantly? In your mind. I say, let's make an apple tree. Right now in the room, there's 40 apple trees. How did it get there? You wanted it to be there. You had a ratzon that there should be an apple tree, and therefore your ratzon was mahave, an apple tree. That tree in your mind is a pure gilui of your ratzon. Everything about that tree in your mind at every moment is just doing exactly what you want it to be doing. It's growing apples, green apples, red apples. It's a tall tree, it's a short tree. The tree gets knocked over by the wind. Every aspect of the mitzias of that tree at every moment is just whatever you will it to be. So what we're really saying, and again, it's mashma from Nefesh HaChaim that he's saying this, Shirei Das really spells it out explicitly, and I think it fully answers this question. That when you look at an object, is this God? No, it's a watch. Is it not God? It's something separate from God? No, it can't be separate from God. So what is it? This is Gilui Ratzon Hashem. It's not Hashem, it's Ratzon Hashem. Kiviyachal saying, Kiviyachal with a capital Chaf, Kiviyachal saying, it's like we're all kind of living in Hashem's imagination. The apple tree in your mind, it's there in your imagination. There's a little boy playing under the apple tree. He's also in your imagination. What's this whole world? This whole world is Hashem imagining us to exist. Am I Hashem? No, I'm not Hashem. Chelik olakami mal, okay, as a mushal. But am I Hashem? No, I talk to Hashem. I'm not Hashem. I'm something other than Hashem. Am I separate from Hashem? Am I independent of Hashem? There's no such thing as independent of Hashem. Nothing can be independent. When we say in Birchas HaShachar, not Birchas HaShachar, in Birchas Kriya Shema, HaMachadesh betuvo tamid b'chol yom masei bereishis. Hashem is Machadesh tamid Tamid, he's machadish masay bereshis. It's like the tree in your mind is only going to exist as long as you keep desiring it to exist. The moment you stop thinking about the tree, where does it go? It goes back to non-existence. It doesn't decay. It doesn't go somewhere else. It never really had its own mitzias. That tree in your mind is just a product of your will. So Hashem is being machadesh tamid maseh bereshis, is that right now, at this moment, my heart is beating, because at this moment Hashem has a ratzon for my heart to beat. You look at the window, you see a bird flying across the sky. Why is that bird right at this moment flying across that sky that way? Because that's Hashem wanting it to happen. We're watching Hashem's imagination in real time. So hold on a second. Last point I'll make, and we'll take the questions. That with this, we've really answered the kasha. Because when I say I have a tree in my mind, does it exist or doesn't it? What's the level of existence of the tree in my mind? It's not like there's no tree. There's definitely something there. There is a tree in my mind. Is it real? Not as real as me. That's Einod Milvado. Relative to the tree, I'm a real existence. Einod Milvado. That tree doesn't have its own existence. It's a figment of my imagination. So it exists, but the existence of that tree in my mind is a sub-level of reality compared to the ultimate reality of the one who's willing it. That's Einod Milvado. Okay, now I know there's a bunch of questions here. Yeah? How an infinite being can have a ratzon? Very good. So Rav Dessler says like this. Rav Dessler says, in Chelik Gimel of Mikra Eliyahu, I can find it for you exactly. He quotes a Zohar. The Zohar says, in order for Hashem to have a ratzon, what caused Hashem to have the ratzon? If Hashem mamash has a ratzon, then he's kind of chasir until he's mamala his ratzon. So the Zohar says no. Hashem doesn't be'etzim have a ratzon. Hashem had a ratzon to have a ratzon. Where did that ratzon come from? He had a ratzon to have the ratzon to have the ratzon. Where did that ratzon come from? Leis machshava tvisa beklal. We can't answer that question. We get stuck because we're living in a world where for us, in our finite world, ratzon means chisaron. And if I want something, it means I don't have it. It means I want it, right? I want chocolate cake. I want to sleep. Ratzon means until I'm memale what my ratzon is, there's a chisaron. That's true for human beings, but it doesn't mean it has to be true for Hashem. That's the best we can do. But what the Zohar is really saying when it says Leis Machshava Tfisa Beklal is you can't apply a human psychology of ratzon onto something that's not human, onto something that's infinite. Even calling it Ratzon Hashem, you should realize, even calling it Ratzon Hashem is itself just a mashal. Does Hashem be'etzim have a Ratzon? No. It's our human way of describing, from our perspective, what's going on with Hashem. We call this world Ratzon Hashem. And all we're really saying by that is we're saying, by calling this world Ratzon Hashem, it's the best human way of describing the idea of a Bria. It's the best human. There's no more accurate way of describing what it means that Hashem created. Is it really what Hashem is doing? We're never in Hashem's shoes. We're only in our own shoes. So I can't say Klapei Hashem how it's actually happening. We can only talk from our perspective of how we relate to it. That's why this mashal, as good as a mashal as it is limited. It's a mashal Klapei our experiences. Yeah. Say again, if Klapei... Right. So good. So now there's one of the questions that now comes out of this whole discussion is, okay, if all we are Ratzon Hashem, and my heartbeat is Ratzon Hashem, and my finger is moving as Ratzon Hashem, then it leads to the question of Bechira. How can I possibly have a Bechira to do other than Ratzon Hashem? How can Hashem be Mitzvah Adam and Gan Eden, not Tif Netzadas, and yet Adam has the independence to say, well, I'm not going to listen to you, I'm going to do what I want, not what you want. That's a question we can't answer in 2 minutes, but I'll save it for next class, okay? We're going to see, if you really think about this whole mashal, there are 2 or 3 good questions that come out of it. One of them is the question of Bechira. So we'll see what we can do with it. I'll tell you, I'll just point out for next class, to me, the 2 big questions on this whole idea, one is Bechira. You might want to say my existence is not independent of Hashem, but my Bechira, in order for it to be called my Bechira Chofshi, has to be somehow separate from Hashem, but Same problem. How do you have anything separate from Hashem? That's one question. Second question is, if we're describing Hashem as infinite and not needing it, he doesn't be'etzem have a ratzon that he needs to create, so then it really leads to another question altogether. Why did Hashem do it? If he's an infinite being and doesn't need to do anything, he doesn't need to be a borei, he doesn't need to be a makayim, he doesn't need to be machadesh. If he's infinite, he's not getting anything out of it. It's not doing him any good. He's not becoming happy, fulfilled, satisfied, bigger. He doesn't need anything and he can't get anything. To say that Hashem created because it gave him X, now that there's a Bria, he is something that he wasn't before, impossible. Hashem can't change. There's no such thing as time. He became a king. What does that mean? It's a mushal. Ein melech b'loam. So I'll create a world, so I'll be a king. Does it mamash mean Hashem became a king? Hashem's beyond time. There's no such thing as Hashem becoming anything. There's no such thing as Hashem needing to become a king. Hashem creates the concept of malchus. He's not be'etzem a melech that's lonely because there's nobody there praising him. So what the other question that this leads to is, what's the whole tachlis? If Hashem has no needs, if Hashem has no limitations, if Hashem isn't be'etzem lacking, what's the possible tachlis of Hashem creating altogether? So the question of tachlis and the question of bechira, to me, are the two big questions that come out of this idea. We have time for one more quick question. Actually, we don't. Sorry, it's 6 o'clock. Let's stop here. I'll take whatever questions next time we meet. I'm going to be away for the next 2 weeks. I'm in Chutz La'aretz, obviously with Purim and Pesach and whatever. Next time I come back, I want to answer questions and deal with bechira and deal with tachlis abriya.